welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. One of the New Year's resolutions that I think all of us can certainly make is that where we can learn to forgive and accept, especially when it comes to situations such as conflict resolution. I mean, after all, we take a look at the fact that we just had this recent election where we had a bunch of people in the millennial generation marching down the streets of Portland, Oregon, deciding, well, we're just not really happy with the outcome. Busting out windows and certainly getting in situations where there was conflict were something that we probably could have found a resolvedness in ourselves. Learning how to forgive and accept situations and ways that we can come to confront those things and deal with our fears. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today someone who's going to share a spiritual approach to this very thing, John Tyler. John, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Daniel, thank you for the opportunity. This is wonderful.
Now, tell us, what is it that causes us to have conflict in the first place?
Well, the source of conflict is that would be several books, I think. But I think conflict comes from the assumption that there's, frankly, in the universe, limited good, and that there's going to be this, as the result of this unequal distribution, unfairness, and people reacting to that in one way or another. And the key word here is react. It's a perception that individuals have that there's something that's not right, and that somehow the situation needs to be changed. The reaction takes place, and then the effort to, if you will, redistribute the good in a situation that appears fairer to those who are engaging in the conflict.
Now, let's talk about certain types of conflict that people don't understand that we might want to talk about here today.
Okay. I'm going to be making a presentation in Portland in just a week, the 19th, and one of the things I'm going to be talking about is the opportunity, because conflict occurs, and I think we can deal with it in just a wide variety, almost infinite variety of contexts. What I'm going to be doing is looking at three levels of conflict. One would be simply face-to-face, interpersonal conflict, the kind of things that, arguments, disagreements, and often things that get much more serious than just an argument, and illustrate how a spiritual approach can heal, can deal with and resolve conflicts at that level. And then the second is at the community level, and the third is at the national, international level.
Now, it's interesting to use from your spiritual approach, a Christian Scientist way of doing this. Now, tell us what embodies that, where people can come to understand, this seems kind of reasonable. This is pretty much, a way that I hadn't understood before.
Well, you mentioned Christian Science, and this is the presentation I'm going to be making in a week is sponsored by several Christian Science churches in Portland, and the founder of the religion, a New England woman, Mary Baker Eddy, and this founding took place in the second half of the 19th century, had an understanding, basically, of the way in which Jesus healed. I mean, it's kind of interesting. She grew up in a very religious New England family, congregational kind of Calvinist theology, but from that basis, discovered of a wide variety of ways, essentially the ideas that Jesus was teaching to his own students, his disciples, to do the kinds of things which he was demonstrating, which he was illustrating. The healings and so forth that are recorded in the 4 biographies of Jesus in the New Testament are essentially descriptions of, at least this is her way of understanding it, descriptions of the way in which Jesus' students could do what he did. In other words, what are often identified as miracles, something which kind of disturbs the natural order. It kind of reverses that and establishes this idea that what Jesus was doing was the normal thing. He was operating on the basis of an understanding of a divine government, what he called the kingdom of God, and within that context, the overcoming of problems, physical problems, but problems of conflict also, being able to do that was something that was natural, and it was what he was teaching his disciples to do. So essentially, it's that approach. And I'm sorry, I've used a lot of words.
No, you're doing fine. Believe me.
Your question. Well, to me, the interesting thing is that we've come, I think, in the past 100 years, let's say, 4 generations, to appreciate the role that forgiveness plays in conflict. It's interesting because conflict resolution is something which is, there are now peace institutes. You can take courses at most universities in conflict resolution, and it's something that has really come to the front over the past couple of generations, and frankly, this is a wonderful development, and it's the power that it has to deflect the kind of some of the reactions which our culture teaches us, that somehow vengeance is now normal and natural. There's just so much of that in our the kind of mental environment in which we grow up. There's an expectation. Films in particular, movies and TV programs and plays, kind of assume that when something very wrong is done by someone towards someone else, that it's normal to react and then either sulk, but more typically seek revenge. And that's a good thing, according to a lot of these stories. And what this gradual development, I think, is leading us towards is a recognition is, no, that's not a good thing. In fact, it's a terrible thing. It gets you into the problem. It prolongs the problem because your reaction then creates a reaction on the part of the other person or individuals. So all this to say that this focus on forgiveness is, I think, very welcome and is being practically used in concrete situations. I'm particularly aware of some in African countries where the acts have just been horrendous that need to be forgiven, but where there's a recognition that reaction is not going to help. That there needs to be another means of dealing with this. So this is good. Now, the reason I've said all that with regard to the present concept of forgiveness is that Jesus takes us a step further, and it's in fact a crucial step. He recognizes the importance of forgiveness in his teachings. For him, it's something that is absolutely essential. There's a kind of interesting moment in his teaching where he's clearly indicating how important forgiveness is, and the most vociferous of his students, St. Peter, recognizing that forgiveness is very, very difficult, says kind of, well, if I try it 7 times, isn't that enough? Because he knows it's so difficult. And Jesus answers, no, his particular answer is not until 70 times 7. And what that really means is, no, there's no way of getting around it. Forgiveness is absolutely essential. But there's a, I think, an element here that is often missed, and that is, in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he underlines love as one of the most important ways in which we need to think and act in our lives. And he indicates that it's so important and it needs to be so universal in our behavior that we love our enemies. But I think he's conscious of the fact that at one level that's impossible. Because once you've defined someone as an enemy, you're in a position where you can't love him. You know, if he's your enemy, there is a contradiction in terms here. Mm-hmm. And this is where the insight of Mary Baker Eddy comes in, because there's a little essay that she wrote called "Love Your Enemies," and she begins that with essentially. Let me see if I can just find that, because it's to me it's a very, very interesting set of questions that she asks right at the beginning of. It's just about 5 pages. This little essay, and she says, "Who is thine enemy that thou shouldst love him? Is it a creature or a thing outside thine own creation?" And then the third sentence is another question. She says, "Can you see an enemy except you first formulate this enemy and then look upon the object of your own conception?" When I was in a situation where I recognized I needed to learn to love my enemy, a specific enemy, and that just blew me away. You know, that idea, I had created my enemy, and I came to see that that's in thought. That's what we do. We have this category, you know, of an enemy, and we identify someone's behavior, and then we begin to see that's that person. He is now my enemy. And to me, that gives us a means beyond what's taught in the conflict resolution courses in our universities and other schools. That takes us beyond that, because it's based on some premises that are usually somehow people don't want to go that far, I think. And the prime premise is that God's creation, and this includes every individual, is essentially godlike, is really a spiritual creation. We identify people physically and you know, through all our physical senses, but there's a spiritual sense that we can use, and we all have, through which we can come to be conscious of, even keenly aware, alert to, that spiritual sense which is capable of identifying the godlike nature of each individual, and when we're in a conflict situation, in particular, the godlike nature of that individual whom we tend to identify as an enemy.
You know, it's interesting when you were speaking earlier about how, for instance, in movies, we tend to see this ideal of retribution. We need to get payback, you know, somehow there's revenge that's in order here. And you realize that when that occurs, you don't really see that kind of fulfillment that you think you're going to have. You know, avenging a friend's death or a father's death, or, you know, a situation where you feel that you've kind of been trampled over, and you realize that over time that, for instance, in conflict, that there have been some, I guess, call them great philosophies that have been handed down. For instance, one of the things that comes to mind is Sun Tzu. People might, come to know Sun Tzu 15th century general from China, The Art of War. And one of the big things that is proclaimed in Sun Tzu and his Art of War is to know your enemy is to know yourself. You will fight many battles without any real imminent danger. And to realize just how profound something like that is. Where is this idea of the enemy in and of itself when it isn't you in the first place? And the fact that you're fighting these battles that really don't have any imminent danger, for instance, but it's really a battle that you have within yourself, but somehow you see this battle outside of you in an enemy that's outside of you, and you recognize that in the first place. And it's pretty interesting when you come to that point to realize, wow, even if you take a look at gangster movies, you tend to hear the philosophy, keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Right.
And you see this played out in areas that people would think, geez, I thought, this was some sort of philosophy on warfare or, the gangster credo, so to speak. But you realize there's a heck of a lot of genius that comes into something when you look at it that way.
Absolutely, yes. And, Daniel, to me, the key there is all this essential activity is taking place in thought. And that's, it's there, where the real battle takes place, and where the resolution of the conflict is going to take place. It's as we are able to overcome our own misconceptions, because when we've defined someone as an enemy, now we're dealing with something that, as Mary Baker Eddy pointed out, we've formulated in our own thinking, and the medical, psychological fields today are concerned with a lot of the horribly negative effects of this sort of what goes on mentally when we're harboring resentments, when we're reacting and hating and building up some kind of plans for revenge. That it's really taking a severe physical toll. But the blessing, in a sense, and this is what I think is this key element in Jesus' teaching. The blessing is something that we gain when we're able to make that redefinition in our thought. And this is where it's not just thinking here, because the thinking that we engage in is often composed of a lot of information that we get from our physical senses, and so that's something we have to sort out. But it's thinking from the standpoint. There's a fantastic statement that Mary Baker Eddy makes in a fundamental textbook that she wrote called Science and Health, with Key to the Scriptures, and I'd like to read that because it's an indication of how essentially how Jesus healed. This is, of course, her understanding of that, but she was able to demonstrate it. That's why she called their discovery a science. 2 sentences. Jesus beheld in science, and by that she means from a spiritual perspective. So Jesus beheld in science the perfect man who appeared to him where sinning mortal man appears to mortals. Next sentence. In this perfect man, the Savior saw God's own likeness. And this correct view of man healed the sick. So he was obviously not using his physical senses. She's describing him using the spiritual sense. And in this perfect man, that's the true identity of each individual. In this perfect man, the Savior saw God's own likeness. And, in the very beginning of the first chapter of Genesis in the Bible, we have that description of how God created man in his image and likeness. So she's describing Jesus as using this spiritual sense to kind of break through what the physical senses are seeing on the one hand, man as a physical body, but also breaking through this picture of an individual who is kind of a mixture of good and evil and has created some evil which is doing you damage or was doing him damage. Breaking, just sort of mentally pushing all that aside to be able to sense very simply his godlike nature. He saw God's own likeness, and this correct view of man healed the sick. And that's an extraordinary statement, because this is, I think this is what she felt was getting at the key to how Jesus healed physically.
Right. You know, it's interesting when you say that, and I wanted to kind of give a little bit of a context here. There was I guess a wonderful example. You talk about miracles by seeing exactly what you're talking about, God's own likeness. You know, that you see the correct view of man, for instance.
Yes.
And I like that because one Dr. Hugh Lynn actually was somebody who was assigned to an institution, of course, where there were people who were considered to have mental disorders, and it was a place for the criminally insane, if you will. And these were people who were incarcerated for pretty much carrying out acts that caused them to be incarcerated in the first place. And what was fascinating about this person's work is that, you know, soon as he took his particular position, which was to be a behavioral therapist to help these people who were incarcerated, is that they began seeing situations where these prisoners were calming down, that they weren't causing the kind of trouble they were causing before. Coming to a point, for instance, where some of them were actually given opportunities to leave the area, to go on short little furloughs, if you will. Pretty amazing, and in some cases actually having their sentences commuted and they were set free. And they couldn't understand, what was this guy doing? And what was fascinating about it, he says, well, if you really want to see what I'm doing here, it's this. And he had brought someone into his office where he would put down a file of a particular prisoner, and he would simply go through this process, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, and I love you, which is known as the concept of the Hawaiian Ho'oponopono, as it's understood. And the idea is that he's seen exactly what we were talking about. He's seen himself. You know, the reason he was there in the first place was, it's sort of like we all kind of find ourselves in adversity, and we like to take the situation where we become victims, rather than taking 100% responsibility for where we are. And that's exactly what his approach was. You know, he realized, these people aren't different from me, they are me.
Mm-hmm.
And he accepted the responsibility of that and asked for forgiveness and healing. And this is what changed them.
Wow.
And what you're talking about here is pretty much right on the money. And you would take a look at that situation, for instance, and realize, well, these are miracles happening here. Well, no. What it is, it's somebody accepting the fact that they're there, so it is their 100% responsibility for, you know, engaging in this and finding a way to heal. And it was happening. And it's pretty amazing how we kind of find ourselves separate from other people that we think, you know, we can point our fingers. Look at our, for instance, our presidential election here in 2016. We find this great separation, but yet these two people that we're voting or not voting for are really elements of ourselves.
Yeah.
Pretty fascinating stuff.
It is, Daniel. That's a fantastic story, because it underlines this, really the importance of thought, just that mental atmosphere, and the basic ingredient of going from the standpoint of man, each individual, and I'm perhaps inserting this, but you know, as essentially a creation of God, and whose nature is good, is made up of goodness and spirituality. And then from that, being able to go further, and as you just pointed out, indicate that the real work is in coming to recognize that we can arrive at that, the accuracy of that perception, and you know, that's this is what I think enables us to do that, follow that command of Jesus, which I think is both the most profound and in many ways the most difficult, where we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. And as you pointed out, this is not just Jesus' teachings. This is something which we find echoed in so many thought belief systems. But where if we're really to come to that point, there's a first step that is essential, and it's kind of that command is predicated on that first step, and that is that we love ourselves genuinely. We are able, not in a selfish sense or a self-serving sense, but in the sense that we come to recognize our essential godlike nature and see it and value it, come to the point where we can genuinely love it, and then we're in a position where we can reach out and begin to love others as we've learned to love ourselves. Just a little incident here. There's I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and there's a scout leader, a Jew who has developed something which over the past 11 years has taken place the day after Thanksgiving. He calls it a Ten Commandment hike. And I live in part of the city where there's a real dense concentration of churches. So the Boy Scouts go from church to church, and at each church they talk a little bit about their religion, a little bit about the building, but especially about one of the commandments. And it has seemed, this year, I took part in the same thing with regard to our Christian Science Church in this area, and it just struck me, this was so needed, especially after the election campaign, where they were coming into contact with not just Christian, Jewish, but also Muslim. There was Baha'i, Buddhist, and Hindu, and where you're coming into direct contact with individuals from these different religions, and you're seeing, they're not so different, and fundamentally they're describing their own sense of the importance of valuing and loving each individual in the world. This kind of universal love that is is so needed in the world. But when we're told about others and sort of the terrible things that they represent, we can believe it a lot more easily than when we're actually face to face with an individual who comes from that belief pattern, and we see, this is not the ogre that was described to me.
I was thinking, I remember back on September 11th, 2001, known as 9/11, and I remember the day after. And it was really interesting what I was thinking as I was absorbing, like many people across America and across the world. First of all, why did this happen? It was quite a shock. But what was really more interesting, too, is some of the things that began coming through me. For instance, these people that created this horrendous act on 9/11, they had to be loved. They had to be nurtured. What had caused them to come to a level where they would do something like this? And, I think most people were, as they rebounded from the shock, if you will, or came back into reality, said, okay, we need to go do something about this. But it was already done. And it's pretty amazing how even here in America, our own government has come to a level to talk about terrorism. In other words, that we've seen the enemy and it's now us. but it's still out there, outside of us. And we continue to believe in this particular jihad here in America, not to undermine America and the beliefs or the thoughts of America, but doesn't that kind of sound accurate when it comes to the ideal of the enemy and forgiveness?
Oh, absolutely. And Daniel, your statement, they've got to be loved. To me, that just resonates as that's the answer.
Well, yeah, because they were birthed, to mothers. They were conceived, well, who knows, but let's just assume, from a level of love. Yes. And here they were into the world. They were nurtured, they were fed, but at one point, something went a different direction.
Yes.
And they decided this was necessary.
Yes.
And it was, to sit there and meditate on that and have this come into me made me look at 9/11 in such a different way that as I seen the reaction, especially politically and in the news, I thought, have you people really lost your minds?
Well, that's the key. They've got to be loved. If and it's a necessity, and it's a necessity which is incredibly demanding. And I think this is partly what our country's going through right now. The difficulty of arriving at that point. First of all, of recognizing that they need to be loved. These individuals that we either have identified ourselves as our enemy, or the media is involved in doing, and to come to that point where because I think, frankly, unfortunately, there's only a small percentage of the population which has recognized the need that they've got to be loved. That as the crucial starting point. But having recognized that, then to take the next steps, and this is where I guess I find this book that I've mentioned, Science and Health, with Key to the Scriptures, so incredibly helpful. It's a book that Christian scientists use as a key to understanding the treasures of the Bible. Really, almost a literal key to being able to understand that, and it identifies in a very simple way. Mary Baker Eddy called this the science, and she identifies the logic of the science. Whereas physicists would say that the starting point is that matter exists and we need to understand it. The logic of Christian Science is that God exists, and we need to understand God. We need to understand this thing that St. John calls divine love. And that then becomes the starting point, the cause of everything. And if you work out consistently from that simple cause, and recognizing that, yes, man is made in God's image and likeness. In fact, God as the creator, divine love as the creator, is the source of all reality. And then we have a very simple framework within which to try to redefine. The world is teaching us, there's conflict is natural, and it's inevitable, and it's going to take place in increasing, or at least continuing, enormous amounts, and that's terrible. It just contradicts that by recognizing that it's not only not natural, it's abnormal. It's the opposite of the very nature of man as the creation of divine love. And when we start from that standpoint, then there's a whole different world that opens up, what Jesus called the kingdom of God.
It's pretty interesting, too, when you think, for instance, let's go back to days when all of us were in high school. We certainly found ourselves trying to stretch and realizing, well, boy, this is a heck of a field to navigate, especially for boys. And, when you think about your thinking in situations growing up in an environment like that where there's this need to react and perhaps even defend, and the idea that, well, you got to stick up for yourself, that sort of a thing. And you realize it's in the thinking and in the reaction as you get older that this is something to be learned. This is something you can learn from and you can grow and develop from. And it becomes very difficult sometimes, I think, for a young man especially, and this goes for women as well, is that when you find yourself in a situation of, kind of being pushed, well, do I push back or do I walk away? Well, of course, walking away, people would say, well, you're kind of a sissy, you don't have any courage. There's those kinds of things that can be labeled on you. And you realize, well, I walked away because I found that fight to be unnecessary. And, in the adult years, you find yourself in a lot of those kinds of situations, I think even more so than in high school, because you have the safety of running back home to mom and dad, and there's the comfort of home. But out in the real world, when you're, at a job, for instance, and you're pushed by the boss or an employee, for instance, and you feel this need for retribution, but you step back. Well, maybe you don't see yourself advancing the way you wanted to. Maybe you should have had that courage or established yourself in such a way to say, this is what I demand for myself. This is what I think I'm worthy of, what I deserve. And you didn't do that. And then you go home and, for instance, you stew on this. And you think, shouldn't I have stepped in and demanded what I want? I mean, we hear these kinds of messages all the time. Go out and get what you think you're worth, what you believe you're worth, and demand these things. And you find people that aren't doing this, and you wonder, how do you live with those kind of decisions, for instance?
Well, that's you've described, I think, quite interestingly these challenges, and I think the answer lies in the need to get back to fundamentals, and the situations you're describing are ones that we do all meet. The question comes, I think, at a more fundamental level, and that is, how have we learned to define both ourselves and others mentally to begin with? And here, this is where, I can keep coming to stuff that Jesus said, but that's my framework. Jesus has this kind of interesting terminology. He talks about the world. And for him, the world is not good. It's a materialistically based way of thinking, and he tells his students he wants them to go into the world, but not to be of the world. He wants them to be able to act in it, but not to accept its mores, its way of thinking and standards and so forth. And I think that's where the answer lies. It's in having defined mentally for ourselves who we are and who others are, at least to the degree that, and I just a further word with regard to that, defined ourselves really in terms of the image and likeness of God, as spiritual creations, not with separate wills that are going to force their way, but as expressions of goodness, as expressions of divine love. If we see ourselves that way, and if we see the basic nature of every individual as having that's the kernel of their identity. And it's something that we can perceive and appreciate, even though they may have learned all kinds of other ugly habits that they're now performing. We kind of see through that to this kernel of divinity, of goodness, which is their real identity. If we've come to that point, then, in a sense, we've overcome the world. It's in a way a kind of inoculation against reaction, against a sense that vengeance or retribution is ever going to, create anything good. And I don't mean that, punishment shouldn't exist in our society. Of course, those social standards are going to be upheld. But I'm thinking in our own way of conceiving ourselves, in our way in which we relate to others, if we can have the definition of ourselves and of others so firmly ensconced in our thinking that when others, denigrate us or take our, at the simplest level, when you're looking for a parking spot, someone else just, pulls in front of you, and it's a much greater one when someone does something really horrible to you or your family, wanting to react. It's at those points where we can come back, I think, to, well, who am I? What are these? What is the real identity of these other individuals? And that's going to protect us from reaction.
You have spoken in pretty much any venue you can imagine, and you just said something here that kind of reminded me of the fact that you've pretty much been around the block. I mean, we're talking about even, behind the what was known as then the Iron Curtain. But, the fact is, one of those venues, or many of those, could have been in prison. Okay, now here are people who are incarcerated. They're being punished to pay their debt to society. And sometimes I'm of the thought that these people that are in prison are being punished even further. You don't just simply go to jail. You don't go to prison and serve your time, but there's even further punishment depending on what you're in there for. And when you think of somebody who feels a sense of retribution, for instance, when perhaps a life has been taken from a family by this person who is incarcerated, and you realize that this may even come to a level where this person is put to death as a result of their actions, and the sense of retribution, or let's just subtly say it, because it's in the movies, the idea of payback, okay? You took something from me, I'm getting something back from you. But what you also realize is, at least for me anyway, and I certainly haven't been in that position, and I hope I don't as well as anybody else listening to this program today, is that it doesn't feel like there's any closure to that. What are your thoughts on something like that?
I couldn't agree with you more. This is, and frankly, you put it in exactly, I think, the right terms, because there's no closure in the sense that you keep chasing your tail. It's action, reaction, re-reaction, re-reaction, and it's a recipe for disaster. I taught political science for a long while, and you can in human history, you can see this really disastrous sequence, and that's why the problem is the mental atmosphere in which it's assumed that that's normal. If we could get to the point where we were to recognize, you used earlier that description of the individual, who somehow was insulted and walked away. If we could get to the point where the walking away is the natural, normal thing to do, not to react, that's the healthy, that's frankly the loving thing, because you're breaking this vicious cycle of evil. And if we, and I'm not saying that our society doesn't recognize that, and there's a lot of support for that idea, but there's so much on the other side that we have to combat, which seems to not only say that payback is normal, but it's necessary, and and that'll teach them, and all that sort of thing. If we could, mentally just move away from that kind of mental approach, we'd become a healthier society. We'd become, really a society in which these qualities, we'd start, exploring what loving is and what loving means. And I think we're scratching the surface at the moment. We're moving in the right direction, but we've got so far to go.
Well, there's no doubt about that, and you think, too, about your own particular experiences. I remember years ago, going back to high school, in fact, my first year of high school, I remember being in the cafeteria, and all at once, somebody had said something, and I was, kind of walking to a table, and the next thing you know, this guy is in my face. He wants to fight me. I don't even know who this person is.
Yeah.
And, and there's his little buddies, and everybody's watching this just to see what's going to happen, of course. And I said, well, I don't want to fight you. I didn't even know who this guy was. But I stood right there in his face. I'm like, I'm not going anywhere, but I'm not interested in having an entanglement with you. Okay, well, it never happened. And he walked away with his little buddies. And the next thing I know, quite a few girls, and some of them very attractive, man, that was the coolest thing I've ever seen anybody ever do.
Great.
They're like, wow, how about that? But the thing is then you can look back on that and think, and you can replay this situation in your mind and think, why didn't I stand up and whoop that guy, or at least engage in the fight in and of itself? Did I back down because I was a sissy, because I was spineless? And sometimes you deal with those kind of thoughts. Why didn't I stand up for myself?
Yeah.
But I think maybe I did. It was just a matter of context.
Clearly, Daniel, clearly you did. And as you described it, it's just that's exactly what I think our culture needs. It's a valuing, essentially, of that sense of our own integrity, where we're not going to be defined by the standards of someone else, and that consciousness. For me, there's this sense of divine guidance. I guess that if it's the opposite of listening to what the culture or the society's norms are. It's stopping and saying, what is the right thing in this case? God is communicating to me constantly. Mary Baker Eddy has a sentence that I just love. It's love inspires, illumines, designates, and leads the way. And by love, she means God. That divine love is God itself, and that's the whole thing. It gives us the idea. It gives us an understanding of the context. It points us in the right direction, but it doesn't just leave us there. It takes us by the hand. And that awareness, that's going on constantly. That's 24/7. This divine love is right here with me, and it's guiding me. And then I can expand that a little bit and recognize, it's with everyone else. Even this guy who's standing in front of me and kind of challenging me, I can refuse to accept that picture of a potential bully, and replace it with the recognition of, this is God's creation. This is a beautiful expression of divine qualities, of goodness, that with my spiritual sense I can begin to appreciate.
I can't help but using a sports story here, because I think this is so right on the money. But when you go back to, let's say, the 1980s and the Detroit Pistons, for instance, NBA basketball champions, back-to-back, and they were known as the Bad Boys. Now, I think this is an interesting team because certainly after them, the NBA had changed, especially when it came to the way that you were allowed to play the game. It isn't as physical as it used to be. And the reason they were called the Bad Boys is they were known to be able to take you out of your game in such a way that you were thinking too much about them. You were so frustrated about them that you were off your game. In other words, they're controlling it by your emotions, by the way you play, and that's how they were capable of winning. It wasn't that they had extraordinary talent, it's just they were highly talented and irritating you to the point that you forgot that you're in here to play the game of basketball, shoot the ball through the hoop, and win.
Right.
And there's a situation you realize, well, of course, Michael Jordan was one of those phoenixes, I guess, if you will, that rose from those ashes, and of course went on to win 6 NBA titles. But he says, I don't think we would have ever been able to play to that level if it hadn't have been for what the Detroit Pistons had done. And this was a guy that, rather than becoming better and realizing, this was a guy that became, of course, the greatest basketball player on planet Earth, but, he was beaten down enough that his reaction was, I had to go the next summer and I had to train harder. I had to really physically get myself to a level mentally and physically where I could take the kind of beatings that I was taking. And, of course, you can see the end result.
Right. Well, I think that's an interesting illustration of, it's overcoming fear. it's not bowing to that idea that that I'm going to be afraid of this and distracted, and not and not by vengeance, but because of my own abilities. Just the confidence in who I am. Yeah, it's a good illustration.
And it was interesting, too, because you realize that as his, I guess, teammate Scottie Pippen, who once they realized, well, we can't contain Jordan anymore, we're going to go ahead and mess with him. But then he began to mature, and you see a situation where they're in a playoff game where Scotty's really just taking it. I mean, and the refs aren't calling nothing, and Scotty's just starting to smile now. And Jordan just keeps pulling him up, and he says, look, these guys are frustrated because they can't get to us anymore. Mm-hmm. Play the game. Stay focused on what we're doing here. And you realize that in sports, even though, for instance, football, it could be hockey, any of that, when you start to pierce through and realize, boy, these are metaphors here that we could take in our daily lives. Yeah, right. Going into the office or being in a relationship that maybe doesn't feel like it's working, and you realize you're not taking the upper road, that these are, as you said, these are God's loving creations that are teaching us how we can become better versions of ourselves. Boy, that's very liberating, isn't it?
It is. It really is. And it diverts attention away from, well, in your example, for example, the physical intimidation, towards sensing, an appreciation for my own, and these qualities, in basketball, you can see the divine qualities, the agility, the grace, to some degree selflessness, because the good player isn't just keeping the ball for himself, and I mean all of these qualities are ones that we can define spiritually, and then when we're focused on those qualities, we're not distracted by the physical stuff.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating too how much it really does liberate you. Boy, I just about got pulled into this situation here, and I realized, no, I can step back and, well, I am of this situation, and to simply forgive. And I think sometimes forgiveness is one of those words that I don't know that people really clearly understand until they genuinely have experienced what forgiveness really means.
Well, Daniel, it's so much of what we're talking about. It comes down to, what are we practicing? We need, I think, to be aware of the fact we can't wait until some kind of crucial moment comes and then say, well, I'm going to practice forgiveness at that point. We've got to be doing it for little tiny things. The example of someone pulling into your parking space. Are we going to condemn that individual, or are we going to recognize that, that's God's creation? They need a parking place just as I do, and so on. With regard to this simple everyday putting into practice. Right today we have these. We've just gone through this bruising election campaign. We need, I think, each of us a sense of forgiveness with regard to the extent that we've been mentally, involved in cheering our guy and hoping the other is going to lose. A mental state in which we're able to see through the acts that we associate with the other individual. We don't have to forgive them, but we can see that's not the real identity of that individual. And then we're protected from reacting, from the anger and the desire to see that individual, in some way denigrated by the press or even political parties and so forth. We can begin to sense spiritually the real spiritual identity of these individuals, and even more than that. And this is, I'm saying this, as a Christian scientist who takes this idea of the kingdom of God quite seriously, because there's a spiritual awareness of government, I think, which can go on, which transcends all of the human expressions of national governments, even UN and so forth, and in which our own appreciation of the fact that goodness is a power, divine love is a power, and it's recognizing this is like the light, and hatred and vengeance are like darkness. Darkness, isn't a thing. Darkness is a non-thing. It's simply the absence of light. And in the same way, vengeance, hatred, resentment, and so forth is just non-love. And as we're able to sense that what's really present, if we could just sense it, is an infinite quality and quantity of love. And with that consciousness, it doesn't mean we're not going to be pushed, jostled, and so forth. But with that consciousness, then we're not going to react when we're in those difficult situations.
Having a guest on our program, I remember years ago, made me begin realizing the idea of reaction. And it was at a point where I realized, in each situation that you feel this automatic need to react, it's usually because you're afraid that you come to understand yourself. And again, seeing, as you say, these experiences begin teaching us about who we are individually. It's quite an interesting thing that the more you start paying attention, I can feel that reaction coming up, and catching that. Well, what's going on here? Why do I feel this need to react? Exactly. And I remember studying, Chinese philosophy back in my 20s and realizing there's the tiger who reacts, very powerful. But then there's the dragon who's also very powerful but wise, but simply initiates action. And you realize as you react, somebody now has, or a situation now has control over you. Mm-hmm. When you initiate, action, it's a much different thing altogether. You decide the course of which this action goes. Pretty wise stuff when you think about it.
It is indeed, yes. Yes, indeed.
Now, is there a place, I know that you give talks, everywhere it seems like, that people can find out where your speaking engagements are and to come to know this idea that we've been talking about, which is conflict resolution?
Well, there's the one coming up on the 19th at it's the Old Church Concert Hall, I think that's the name of it. And that's at 7 on the 19th. There's a site, actually if you just Google John M. Tyler, middle initial M, period, there will be a list of lectures and where I'm going to be giving them for the next several months.
Well, very good. I think this is something everybody should engage and come to embrace and understand, because it's pretty liberating to know that, wow, these are all life opportunities for me to grow and to develop, to be able to share with others as well, and to empower, most importantly. Again, to be able to be in that place where peacefully we can come to see our lives initiating action. It's kind of a nice place to be.
It's wonderful.
John, I want to thank you so much for joining us here on the program today. And again, you did give out a website?
Well, there's the John M. Tyler, which Googled will get you to. That's ChristianScience.com. Mm-hmm. And there is one. I wish I had it at hand, but
well, no, I've got one here, which is pdxlectures.com as well, which of course, are lectures here in the Portland, Oregon area. But that's what I have here in front of me as well. But John Tyler, John M. Tyler, you said, you just Google that, and you can find out what's going on and where you're at. Exactly. Yes,
there's several lectures that are available on YouTube, and they're just John Tyler Christian Science would get you to these talks that are available.
Very good. John, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today. It's been a pleasure.
Daniel, it's been a real joy for me. Thank you.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can also discover more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter to stay up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as upcoming shows. Follow us on Twitter as well as Facebook at Beyond 50 Radio. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.